They said a tournament was the safest place a knight could bleed, a field fenced with honour, watched by lords and heralds, guarded by rules that promised order where real battle offered none. But in the summer of 1274, on the fields near Châlons, those rules bent, then broke. Before swords were drawn, the day began like any other tourney day, the sound of horses being shod before dawn. Men tightened straps along their arms and murmured short prayers, not for victory, but for survival without shame. Tournaments had always balanced on that thin line between spectacle and danger. Everyone knew it. Knights rode for reputation. Lords rode for alliances. Spectators came for the thunder of hooves and the moment when two lances met with a crack that echoed across the field. But beneath that roar lived something quieter, the understanding that a single mistake could turn practice into death. At Châlons, that mistake came quickly. Some said the count reached too far, some said the king struck too hard. Others whispered that tempers had been sharpened long before the jousts even began. What is certain is this: one pull at the reins, one hand at a royal shoulder, and the lines between play and war dissolved. When the dust settled, the lists looked nothing like a tournament ground. They looked like a battlefield. Bodies lay where cheers had been, and those who survived would not forget how swiftly pageantry had collapsed into panic. Yet the true reckoning did not happen there among the fallen. It waited beyond the field, at the banquet table where lords gathered to see who would pay the price for what the day had revealed. By the time of Châlons, tournaments had already lived several lives. The earliest ones were barely controlled. Knights met in open countryside, not in fenced lists, but across miles of uneven ground. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of riders formed two great lines and crashed together in what was called the melee, a mock battle that often forgot it was supposed to be mock. There were rules, in theory. Ransoms could be claimed for captured horses and armor. Certain weapons were discouraged. But once men were galloping at full speed, rules turned thin. The Church reacted first. In 1130, Pope Innocent II condemned tournaments outright. He called them gatherings of reckless pride, places where men chased empty honor. And he laid down a hard sentence. Any knight who died in a tournament was to be denied Christian burial. For nearly 2 centuries, that decree remained on the books. It was meant to frighten knights away from the lists and back toward more acceptable forms of piety. Instead, it did something stranger. It acknowledged in official language just how dangerous a game these events had become. Over time, some lords tried to tame them. The melee shrank. Individual jousts, one knight against another, grew more common. Blunted lances were introduced, armor thickened. Heralds checked shields and lineage, turning part of the chaos into ceremony. But nothing could change the simple fact beneath it all. 2 fully armed men on war horses charging at each other with long wooden poles were never going to be truly safe. Everyone at Châlons understood that risk. They simply trusted that this time the rules would hold. On that day at Châlons, the structure of the tournament followed a familiar pattern. First came the arrival. Knights rode in with their retinues, servants carrying extra lances and shields, squires leading spare horses. Banners marked the presence of great lords in kings. Tents rose like a small, temporary city along the edge of the field. Then came the displays. Armor was polished to a dull shine. Too much brightness could be blinding in the sun. Helms were topped with crests that bordered on the ridiculous. Wings, beasts, towers, anything to make a knight stand out in the crush. There was nothing careless about it. Every color, every emblem, every ribbon tied to a lance carried meaning. A lady's favor knotted at a wrist could raise a man's status almost as much as a victory in the lists. The crowd settled in. Merchants worked the edges of the grounds, selling food, drink, small trinkets. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Priests watched as well, uneasy witnesses to a sport their superiors had condemned, but their patrons still demanded. Then the horn sounded. Horses stepped forward. Lances came down. The first passes were clean. 2 men met, wood shattered, someone stumbled, someone recovered. The crowd roared. It felt, for a moment, like the script everyone expected. But all of it, armor, banners, rituals, cheers, rested on one fragile assumption: that no one in power would lose their temper badly enough to turn spectacle into real war. At Châlons, that assumption failed in the space of a single gesture. Different chroniclers described the crucial moment in different ways, but all agreed on its effect. The Count of Châlons, host of the tournament, closed with King Edward I of England. Perhaps it was during a melee, when groups of knights crashed together in a storm of hooves and steel. Perhaps it was during a looser exchange, when the lines had already blurred. What they recorded is this: at some point, the Count reached for the king. One account says he grabbed Edward by the neck of his mail. Another claims he seized the king's helmet and tried to twist him from the saddle. Whatever the exact hold, it looked less like sport and more like an attack. To lay hands on a king in a game was an insult that cut deeper than any lance. For a heartbeat, the field might have held its breath. Then everything broke. English knights, seeing their king threatened, spurred forward. The Count's men moved to defend him. Blunted weapons gave way to real fury. Some reached for daggers, others drove home blows meant to bruise now and wound later. The melee that followed was no longer practice, it was a fight. Horses went down, dragging men with them. Spectators pushed forward and then backward as the edges of the combat shifted. Somewhere in the confusion, arrows flew. No one could say from which side. By the time the disorder ebbed, the field at Châlons had earned a new name in memory. Not a tournament, but the little battle of Châlons. It was the sort of day that could end more than lives. It could end reputations, friendships, and carefully balanced alliances. Which is why, in spite of everything, the feast afterwards was not cancelled. It was essential. Moving from the lists to the great hall was itself a kind of ritual. Armor came off in pieces like layers of a roll being shed. Helms, dented and smudged, were lifted away. Mail was unlaced. Padded gambesons soaked with sweat were peeled from skin rubbed raw at shoulder and hip. Men washed quickly, if water was close. Some simply wiped away the worst of the dirt and blood before wrapping themselves in finer cloth. They did not have the luxury of disappearing to be alone. The feast waited, and absence could be read as guilt or fear. Inside the hall, long tables had been arranged in lanes as orderly as the lists had once been. The highest table stood on a dais, reserved for the most powerful guests. Below it sat lesser lords, below them their households. Servants moved like a second, quieter army, carrying trenchers, pitchers, knives. A herald might step forward to recite names and titles. Minstrels tuned instruments. Candles were lit wherever daylight struggled to reach. The smell here was different from the field. Less of iron and horse, more of smoke, fat, and spice. If the day had been clean and brutal, the night would be layered and careful. For it was at this table, not on the torn earth outside, that men would decide what story to tell about what had happened. Was it a misunderstanding, an insult, an unforgivable attempt on a king? Those questions would not be debated in open argument. They would be answered in what was served, where people sat, and which dishes carried whose banners. In the Middle Ages, a high feast spoke in symbols. Bread arrived first, or nearly so, large loaves carried in on wooden boards, then torn or cut into thick slices. To share bread at a lord's table was to be acknowledged as part of his circle, even if only for a night. Wine or ale followed, filling cups that were rarely left empty. To refill a rival's cup too generously could be kindness. It could also be a test. Then came the dishes that truly mattered. In the 14th century, a French cookbook called Les Viandières collected recipes for foods designed specifically for such moments. One of its most striking creations was a pie in the shape of a castle, a torte parmigiana, or Parmesan-style pie. The recipe began with meat, mutton, veal, or pork, chopped small, and cooked with fat. Chicken was boiled separately, then added whole or in large pieces. Spices, cinnamon, ginger, long pepper, clove were ground into a fine powder and mixed through the meat until it no longer tasted simple. But the crust was where the real meaning lived. It was not a thin, flaky pastry meant to shatter under the knife. It was a hot water dough, kneaded until strong, built high with walls thicker than a man's thumb. Crenellations were carved along the top, turning the pie into a model fortress. Saffron stained the surface a rich yellow. In an age when the color of gold was itself a statement, this detail mattered. Inside, cooks sometimes added pine nuts and currants. Later versions multiplied the luxury: figs, dates, prunes, herbs, even brie cheese to bind it all. Then, when the castle stood complete, pieces of boiled chicken were fixed at the top, and into those pieces were planted small flags. Not just the flag of the host, the flags of every lord present. To place a man's banner on your castle pie was to make a quiet promise before witnesses. It said, "You are seen here. Your presence strengthens my table. We are, at least tonight, aligned." The host might have the largest banner, but to omit someone of rank would be noticed at once. A missing flag could speak as loudly as an empty chair. And then, as servants carried the pie into the hall, every eye would turn. Here was a fortress you could march across with the tip of a knife. Here were walls that did not keep enemies out, but drew guests in. Here was a castle no besieging army could claim, but that one knife, in the right hands, could open. At some feasts, the pie was cut reverently. At others, it was broken open with a bit of theatre, the crust cracking like a fallen tower. Sometimes guests ate the walls. Sometimes only the filling was served, and the crust left as a fading monument on the board. For the common people of a medieval town, such a dish existed only in rumour. Most would eat dark breads, broth, perhaps a bit of pork or fish on rare occasions. The castle pie belonged to a different world.
the world of men who fought in armor and settled what that fighting meant while seated on benches, knives in hand, music at their backs. On a night like the one that followed Châlons, such a dish would have carried even more weight. Which flags flew on its ramparts? Which hands reached for the first slice? Who watched, and who pretended not to?
The castle pie was showpiece enough, but medieval noble tables rarely stopped at one marvel. Cooks across Europe developed a catalogue of dishes whose primary purpose was to amaze. There were pies that, when opened, released live birds. The recipe instructed the cook to bake the pastry hollow, then slip small birds inside just before the dish was brought to table. When the knife cut through the crust, wings burst into the air, and the hall filled with beating feathers and astonished laughter. There was the helmeted rooster, a cockerel roasted and then mounted on the back of a pig, as though riding into battle. A small lance was fitted between its wings, and a paper or metal helm fixed to its head. Recipes recommended covering the helm and weapon in gold or silver leaf. There was the cockatrice, an invented beast built from the front half of a pig and the back half of a capon, stitched together before roasting and painted in saffron to glow the color of wealth. And then there was the peacock. Its body was plucked, roasted, and seasoned. Its skin with feathers still attached was carefully slipped back over the cooked flesh so that the bird looked almost alive again. For the boldest hosts, instructions suggested one more step. Fill the beak with spirits and fragrant powders so that when lit, the bird seemed to breathe fire. These dishes did more than entertain. They declared that the host owned enough land, enough animals, enough labor to stage a fantasy at supper. They transformed the act of eating into a performance about control over nature, over resources, over the very idea of hunger. While peasants measured grain by the handful, some lords turned excess into art. The chroniclers who wrote about Châlons recorded the dust, the confusion, the moment when order snapped, and then they stopped. Not a word survives about the feast that followed. No list of who sat where. No record of who addressed whom. No note about silence, hesitation, or ceremony. But in the Middle Ages, a missing description tells us less about the event than about the priorities of the men who wrote it. A noble feast did not need to be recorded to be understood. Its purpose was always the same. A banquet after a day like Châlons was a place where the shock of the field was absorbed and interpreted. A hall like that judged not by proclamation but by atmosphere, by the weight of glances, by who approached and who waited, by who carried themselves steadily and who entered the room unsure of their footing. We do not know which man hesitated that night. We do not know whose voice sounded strained or whose composure held firm. But we do know how such rooms functioned. A medieval feast revealed two things with absolute clarity: who had lost ground and who had not. Not through speeches, but through subtler verdicts. A cup raised or ignored, a banner placed high or low, a seat offered promptly or after a beat too long. The field showed the violence, the hall showed its consequences. Even without a single chronicler describing that night, the structure of the age makes one truth certain. A feast did not need details to reveal the price. It revealed it simply by letting every man see how the others now regarded him. The price of a day like Châlons was rarely paid in coin. It was paid in standing. Some men would have entered the hall with their confidence intact. the chaos of the melee having done little to change how others met their gaze. Others would have felt a shift as soon as they stepped inside. A pause where warmth once was, a measured greeting where familiarity used to stand. No chroniclers recorded these shifts because they were not the kind of things men wrote down, but they were the kind of things men remembered. A feast after a failed tournament sorted reputations as reliably as hooves sorted dust. Those who had remained steady under pressure often found themselves steadier still. Those whose actions had caused alarm, whether by intent or misjudgment, discovered that alarm lingering in the eyes of others. A man could lose ground without a single word spoken against him. A man could gain ground without a single boast. This was the economy of the medieval hall, quiet, collective, exacting. We cannot say which individuals gained or lost that night at Châlons. The chronicles deny us that map, but they do not deny us the mechanism, and through that mechanism we can see the truth that mattered. The banquet revealed who paid the price, because the banquet was where the price was paid. Not openly, not dramatically, but in the slow recalibration of respect, the kind that settled over a room and followed men long after the candles guttered out. Long after Châlons, the political language of the medieval feast did not fade. If anything, it grew bolder. No one mastered that language better than Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy in the 15th century, a man who understood that food could move armies as effectively as silver or steel. In 1430, during the celebrations for his marriage to Isabella of Portugal, Philip prepared a tournament and feast so immense that his existing palaces proved insufficient. Rather than diminish the occasion, he built an entirely new banqueting hall, outfitted with kitchens vast enough to sustain a small town. At the center of this hall he placed fountains shaped like beasts from heraldry and myth. A lion that poured red wine, a stag that trickled hippocras, wine sweetened with spices, and a unicorn that flowed with rosewater, perfuming the hall with every shift of the air. When guests entered, the spectacle overwhelmed them before a single dish was served. Years later, in 1454, Philip hosted the now legendary Feast of the Pheasant. A tournament took place that day, but the combat was so overshadowed by the banquet that chroniclers gave it almost no attention. Instead, they recorded what unfolded inside the hall. Heroic legends reenacted as crusading parables, scenes staged between courses, dancers and musicians weaving narratives of duty and faith, and most striking of all, a woman dressed in white, representing the church, entering atop an elephant draped in silk. She implored the assembled lords to vow themselves to the liberation of Constantinople. Philip stood and pledged openly. Many followed. Whether those vows were kept was nearly irrelevant. The point had already been made. At the height of the medieval world, the feast had surpassed the field. The hall could summon emotions, bind nobles to causes, and redirect the ambitions of men who had spent their lives fighting. A dish, a performance, a symbol, each could become a tool of persuasion. Compared to this, a tournament was almost simple. All the magnificence of feasts like Philip's, the fountains, the theatrics, the gilded birds, represents only a narrow slice of medieval life. Beyond the tournaments and the high tables, most people lived according to a rhythm far more austere. The church marked the calendar with fast days, more than 100 each year, when meat was forbidden. On those days, households turned to fish if they were fortunate, or to thin pottages in dark breads if they were not. Hunger was not a symbol. It was a season that returned again and again.
Where nobles weighed honor and reputation, ordinary families weighed survival. How far grain could stretch, how much ale remained in the cask, whether a winter illness or a poor harvest would tip the scales. A single peacock, refeathered and gilded, could cost more than a village consumed in a week. A castle pie, filled with saffron and spice, demanded resources gathered from distant lands, each grain and bark carried by trade routes most people would never see. Both realities, the extravagance of the feast and the strictness of the fast, were held in the same world, often separated only by a few miles of countryside. This contrast gives weight to the events at Châlons. While nobles interpreted honor and consequence through ceremony and dish, their subjects lived within boundaries set by the church, the land, and the uncertainty of each harvest. For the common people, food was not a spectacle, it was endurance. And the feasts of the great, dazzling as they were, rested ultimately on the labor, tithes, and hunger of those who would never sit at such tables.
Today, the field at Châlons is quiet. Grass moves where armor once clattered, and the wind carries nothing of the laughter, tension, or panic that marked that summer day in 1274. But the story remains, not because of what was written, but because of what the age understood. A tournament could turn into a battle in a heartbeat. Blades could break, tempers could flare, and the thin line between ritual and danger could vanish with a single gesture. Yet the meaning of such a day was never decided on the field. It was decided afterward, in the hall, beneath banners and candles, where men sat down to eat and to watch one another. There, the violence of the lists was translated into consequence. Their unspoken judgments were formed, their reputations were steadied, questioned, or quietly redirected. The chroniclers did not record the feast after Châlons. They did not describe who hesitated, who held their gaze, or whose name softened into uneasy silence. But they didn't need to. The structure of the medieval world makes clear what the whole was designed to do: absorb the shock of the field and reveal its meaning. In 1274, Steele wrote the first chapter, but the Banquet wrote the verdict. A tournament became a battle, a meal became a reckoning, and the price of that day was paid not only in the dirt where men fell, but in the quiet, deliberate ceremony of a table where every gesture mattered.